The town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, had seen its share of hard luck and harder men, but nothing had quite managed to hush a room the way Lavinia Wainwright could when she walked through a door. She was 31 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of quiet composure that comes not from ease, but from having survived something enormous and choosing to keep going anyway. She wore her grief like a second skin now, 2 years after Randall Wainwright had died under circumstances that the town could not stop whispering about. And those whispers were the very thing that kept every eligible man in Caldwell Creek at a careful and deliberate distance. The story, as the town told it, went like this. Randall Wainwright had been a prosperous cattle rancher with a temper that burned hot and a reputation that burned hotter, and he had died on a Tuesday morning when his horse threw him near the ravine east of his property. The doctor said it was the fall that killed him. The town, however, said it was the fall that Lavinia had something to do with, which was the sort of cruel arithmetic that small towns in Kansas were particularly gifted at performing. Nobody had proof. Nobody needed proof. They had a widow who had not wept publicly at the funeral, who had paid her debts promptly and stood straight-backed at the graveside, and who had refused every casserole and condolence that had come with strings attached. So they called her cold. They called her calculating. They called her the Wainwright widow, and the men who might otherwise have come calling instead crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming, tipping their hats at a distance that made it perfectly clear they were being polite without being interested. The women were not much better. Most of them had decided that Lavinia's composure was evidence of guilt, and they treated her accordingly, with tight smiles and hollow pleasantries that fooled no one. Lavinia had learned to need no one. She ran the ranch herself now, with 3 hired hands who respected her because she paid them fairly and expected the same honest work in return. She made decisions about cattle and feed and water rights with a clear-headed efficiency that would have impressed anyone who had been paying attention to the right things instead of to the gossip. She rode her own horses, fixed her own fences when the hands were busy elsewhere, and made her weekly trip into Caldwell Creek for supplies with the particular briskness of a woman who has learned that brevity is better than warmth when warmth is not on offer. It was on one of those supply trips, on a bright and cold October morning in 1878, that Edwin Yates rode into Caldwell Creek for the first time. He came from the south, which meant he had ridden up through Indian Territory and across the Kansas line, and he looked like a man who had been doing exactly that for several weeks. His horse was a big roan gelding named Fletcher, according to the conversation he had with the animal as he dismounted in front of the livery stable, and Edwin Yates himself was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that had spent enough years under the open sky to carry permanent lines around the eyes, and a particular kind of stillness that belonged to men who had been alone with their own thoughts for long stretches of time. He was not the most handsome man who had ever ridden into Caldwell Creek. He was better than that. He was the kind of man who became more interesting the longer you looked at him, which was the more dangerous kind. He had worked cattle drives for 12 years out of Texas, most recently completing a run up the Kishom Trail that had ended in Abilene, from which he had come south and west looking for something he could not exactly name but recognized as an absence. He wanted land. He wanted something that was his. He was tired of driving other men's cattle across other men's territory and sleeping under a sky that was always beautiful and never his own. He had heard there was good grazing land outside Caldwell Creek, and a rancher named Haverson who was looking to sell the eastern quarter of his property cheaply because of a water dispute with his neighbor that had made the land more trouble than it was worth. Edwin Yates intended to buy that land, build something small and solid on it, and see what came next. He got his horse settled, washed his face at the pump outside the livery, and walked toward the general store on the main street of Caldwell Creek with the particular unhurried stride of a man who has nowhere urgent to be and knows that rushing never improved anything. He was reading the signs above the storefronts, getting his bearings, when Lavinia Wainwright came out of the general store carrying 2 heavy burlap sacks of flour and a crate of tinned goods balanced against her hip, and she nearly walked directly into him. She stopped. He stopped. The flour sacks were clearly pulling at her arms, and he reached out instinctively and took the heavier of the 2 sacks without asking, which was either presumptuous or practical depending on your perspective. And then he looked at her properly for the first time and said, "Where are you headed?" It was not the reaction she was accustomed to. Men in Caldwell Creek either avoided her eyes or studied her with the specific wariness of people who believe they are standing near something dangerous. This man looked at her the way you look at a person, directly and without calculation, and asked a practical question as if the answer was the only thing that mattered. "My wagon is at the end of the block," she said, after a moment in which she recovered from the surprise. "Then we are headed the same direction," he said, and walked with her. She did not know what to do with that. She glanced sideways at him once, taking in the trail dust on his coat, the comfortable way he carried the heavy sack as if it weighed nothing, the absence of any of the usual social maneuvering. He was not performing courtesy. He was simply being useful. "You are new," she said, because it was the only explanation. "Rode in about an hour ago," he said. "Edwin Yates." "Lavinia Wainwright," she said, watching for the flicker she had learned to expect, the small tightening of a jaw or the slight shift of posture that told her someone had already heard the name and organized their opinions around it. There was no flicker. He nodded as if Lavinia Wainwright was simply a name attached to a person, which was a radical thing to experience in Caldwell Creek in October of 1878. "You are looking for someone?" she asked. "Or something?" "Haverson's land," he said. "East Quarter, heard he might be selling." She set the crate in the bed of her wagon and turned to take the flour sack from him. "Haverson is selling," she said. "Has been for 6 months." The water dispute with the Connolly family made the Eastern Quarter complicated. You should know that before you negotiate. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "You know the details of the dispute." "The Connolly water rights run through the northern edge of that quarter. If you drill a well in the right location, it does not matter. The dispute is about the creek, not the underground table. I have seen the original survey maps. The creek bends east and is entirely on Haverson's deeded property. The Connollys are wrong legally, but they have been loud about it, and Haverson does not have the stomach for a prolonged argument." Edwin Yates studied her for a moment. "That is very precise information," he said. "I am a rancher," she said simply. "Water rights are life and death out here. I pay attention. Mrs. Wainwright," he said, and there was a quality of genuine appreciation in his voice that was entirely different from flattery. "You may have just saved me from a serious miscalculation. I was going to lowball my offer because of the dispute." "Do not lowball it too heavily," she said. "It is good land. Haverson is just tired. There is a difference." She climbed up to the wagon seat, took the reins, and looked down at him. He was squinting up at her with the sun behind her, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite read, something open and interested that had no agenda attached to it that she could identify. "Thank you, Mr. Yates," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Wainwright," he said. Genuinely. She drove away, and she made it 2 full blocks before she realized she was holding the reins more loosely than usual, and that her shoulders had dropped an inch, and that she could not remember the last time she had had a conversation with a stranger that had left her feeling like herself. Edwin went to see Haverson that same afternoon and made an offer that was fair rather than predatory, which surprised Haverson enough that he accepted it within 20 minutes. The paperwork was signed before sundown, witnessed by the county clerk, and Edwin Yates was the legal owner of 180 acres of eastern Kansas rangeland by the time the stars came out over Caldwell Creek. He took a room at the boarding house run by a broad and practical woman named Mrs. Albrecht, who fed him supper and asked him where he was from, and received his answers with approving nods, as if he were passing a test he had not known he was taking. "You met anyone in town yet?" she asked, pouring coffee. "A few people," he said. "Mrs. Wainwright at the general store." Mrs. Albrecht set the coffee pot down with more care than the action required. "Lavinia Wainwright," she said, and there was that thing in her voice, that careful neutral tone that is not actually neutral at all. "She knew the details of the Haverson water dispute," he said, watching Mrs. Albrecht's face. "Saved me from making a bad decision." "She is a sharp woman," Mrs. Albrecht said, in the tone of someone conceding a point while having reservations about conceding it. "What do they say about her?" he asked, because he had spent enough years reading trail signs to recognize when someone was not telling him something. Mrs. Albrecht sat down across from him. She was the kind of woman who, when she decided to speak plainly, spoke very plainly indeed. "Her husband died 2 years ago. Horse threw him near the ravine. The town decided there was more to it than that, without any evidence whatsoever, and they have been treating her accordingly." Edwin was quiet for a moment. "And what do you think?" "I think Randall Wainwright was a hard man with a worse temper, and I think Lavinia survived him, and I think surviving a hard marriage does not make a woman a murderer," Mrs. Albrecht said flatly. "But I am one of perhaps 3 people in this town with that opinion, and the other 2 are the doctor and the county clerk." Edwin drank his coffee. He thought about the way Lavinia Wainwright had carried those flour sacks without complaint, the way she had given him precise and useful information without any trace of performance or expectation, the way she had said, "I am a rancher," as if it were the most complete and sufficient description of herself available. "She is running that ranch alone?" he asked. "With 3 hands," Mrs. Albrecht said, "and doing it better than Randall ever did, if you want my honest observation." He thanked her for supper and went to bed, and he lay for a while in the darkness looking at the ceiling of his new room and thinking about 180 acres of Kansas rangeland that would need fencing and watering and a proper structure before it was habitable, and about the strange and clarifying quality of a conversation with a woman who just said what she knew without dressing it up in anything extra. He fell asleep thinking he had made a good decision coming to Caldwell Creek. The next morning, he walked out to his land for the first time as its owner. He had been out the previous day for the inspection, but walking it as yours is entirely different from walking it as a prospective buyer, and he took his time going over every acre of it, noting where the grass grew thickest, where the soil was soft enough to support a well, where the natural rise of the land would make a good position for a house. He was standing on that rise in the late morning, looking south across the open range, when he heard a horse coming from the west at a working trot, and turned to see Lavinia Wainwright riding a red sorrel mare along what appeared to be a well-worn trail that cut across the northern edge of his property. She pulled up when she saw him. There was a brief moment of calibration in her expression, a quick assessment of whether his presence on this land was something that changed things for her. "I use this trail to get to the north pasture," she said directly. "If you intend to fence it off, I would like to know so I can plan an alternate route." "I do not intend to fence it off," he said. "If it is easier, you can use it as long as it suits you." She relaxed slightly, which was not a large relaxation but was visible if you were paying attention, and he was. "Thank you," she said. "How does the land look to you?" "Good," he said. "Better than I expected, honestly. I want to dig a well on the south slope away from the creek entirely so the water rights question becomes irrelevant." She looked at the south slope. "That is smart," she said. "The rock table is deep there, but not impossibly so. You would want a man with experience." "Do you know one? Silas Greer in town does good well work," she said. "Tell him I sent you." He squinted at her. "Will that help or hurt my case?" For a moment she was completely still, and then something shifted in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was its first cousin, dry and real. "You have heard the town's opinion of me," she said. It was not a question. "I have heard one version," he said. "I prefer to form my own." She looked at him steadily for long enough that it might have been uncomfortable, but he did not look away and she did not either, and what passed between them in that moment was not romantic in any conventional sense, but was something more fundamental than that, a mutual recognition of directness meeting directness. "Silas Greer does good work," she said again, and turned her horse back to the trail. "Mrs. Wainwright," he called after her. She turned her head without stopping. "Would you object to me asking your opinion on the house position? You know this land better than I do." She stopped the horse. She turned it. She came back slowly and looked at the rise where he was standing and then around at the surrounding terrain with the evaluating eye of a person who has spent years thinking about how structures survive in this climate and this wind pattern. "Not there," she said, pointing at the spot where he stood. "The north wind will savage you every winter. Move it 30 yards south and east, toward that flat. The rise will block the worst of it and you will still have the view." He walked the 30 yards south and east and turned and looked, and she was right. From here the rise sheltered the back of the position, and the view opened beautifully to the south and west. "Perfect," he said. "The outbuilding should go here," she said, pointing. "Close enough to be practical, far enough not to block the light." They spent 45 minutes on that land together, and Lavinia Wainwright knew more about the specific character of this terrain than Edwin could have learned in a month of walking it alone, and he listened to every word she said with the complete attention of a man who genuinely understands that knowing what you do not know is a form of intelligence. When she finally turned her horse to go, he said, "I am grateful. Would you allow me to buy you a meal in town? I am not suggesting anything beyond a meal eaten in the company of someone whose knowledge I value." He said it plainly, without hedging or charm, and she heard the plainness of it and evaluated it with the care she gave everything. "Not in town," she said, after a moment. "People in town are watching me with a great deal of interest and limited goodwill, but if you want to stop by the ranch on Sunday afternoon, I can feed you something that is better than anything you will find at the hotel restaurant." He accepted with the same quiet simplicity with which she had offered, and they parted, and Lavinia rode back toward her north pasture and did not let herself think about him until she was safely out of sight, at which point she allowed herself to think about him quite thoroughly. She was not a foolish woman. She knew what it meant to notice a man the way she noticed Edwin Yates, with that particular alive quality in the chest that she had spent 2 years being entirely free of, and had not missed until this very moment revealed that she had missed it after all. She knew also the complication of what she was, a widow with a reputation built on whispers, and what any connection to her cost a person in a town like Caldwell Creek. But Edwin Yates had said, quite plainly, that he preferred to form his own opinions, and she was 31 years old and had been surviving on nothing but her own company and her own determination for long enough that the idea of someone choosing to draw close instead of step away felt like water to a person who had been thirsty for a long time. She would be careful. She was always careful. But she would not be foolish in the other direction either, which was the direction of refusing things purely out of fear. On Sunday, she made a proper meal. Not elaborate to the point of performance, but good and honest. Roast chicken with vegetables from her kitchen garden, fresh bread, apple preserves she had put up in September. She set the table in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, because the formal dining room had been Randall's territory and she had not eaten in it since he died. Edwin arrived on time, which she appreciated, and he came in without ceremony, hung his hat on the hook by the door as if he had done it before, and looked around her kitchen with an expression of straightforward approval. "You have a good place here," he said. "Randall built it," she said, without particular emotion. "I have made changes." "What changes?" She pointed. "The window. It was boarded on the north side. I opened it. The light was worth the cold draft." She pointed again. "The shelves, he had them low. I put them where I could reach them without a step stool." She indicated a third thing. "The table. His was too large for this room. I sold it and bought this one." He was listening to all of this with the particular quality of attention she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him, fully present and retaining everything. "You made it yours," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is a brave thing," he said quietly, "after a loss." She put the chicken on the table and sat down across from him. "Not all losses feel the same," she said, and she met his eyes when she said it because she had decided she was not going to be indirect about her marriage, not to this man who had already demonstrated that he could handle a straight line. He understood. She saw that he understood without her having to say more. "No," he said. "I imagine they do not." They ate and they talked, and the conversation moved like a river over varied ground, easy in some stretches and deeper in others. He told her about the trail drives, 12 years of them, the beauty of the open range at dawn, and the grinding difficulty of moving cattle through rain and rough terrain, and the particular loneliness of always being in motion. She told him about the ranch, the decisions she had made after Randall died, the cattle she had sold and the better stock she had bought with the proceeds, the way the three hands had initially resisted taking orders from her, and the specific patience and consistency with which she had earned their respect. "Tom Briley, my foreman," she said. "He told me after about 4 months that I was the best cattleman he had ever worked for, and he emphasized the word cattleman, and I took it as the compliment he meant it to be." Edwin smiled at that, and it was a good smile, warm and not performed, the smile of someone who found something genuinely funny. "How old is Tom Briley?" 52, she said. "He has been working cattle since before the war. His opinion means something." After the meal they sat on the front porch because the afternoon was clear and cold and beautiful, and the light was going gold over the western range, and they talked until the gold went to rose and the rose went to purple, and then Edwin said he ought to get back before the dark made the ride difficult, and Lavinia walked with him to where he had hitched Fletcher. He untied the horse and turned and looked at her in the last of the light. "May I come back?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Next Sunday." "Yes," she said again. He rode away, and she stood on the porch step watching until the dusk swallowed him, and then she went inside and stood in her kitchen that was hers now, her window and her shelves and her properly sized table, and felt something warm and frightening moving in her chest like a fire that is just beginning to catch. He came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. By the third Sunday, it had become the understood structure of the week for both of them, and by the fourth Sunday, Tom Briley had noticed the pattern and made a single comment, delivered to the middle distance rather than to Lavinia directly, which was his way of saying something without making her responsible for responding to it. The comment was that Fletcher was a fine-looking animal, and the man who rode him seemed to know what he was doing, which from Tom Briley was an endorsement. Edwin's house was going up on the land. He had hired 2 men from town to help with the structure, and was doing much of the work himself, which Lavinia saw evidence of in his hands, calloused in new places now, sawdust occasionally in his hair. The well had been dug by Silas Greer at Lavinia's recommendation, and Silas had told Edwin afterward that Mrs. Wainwright had recommended the right position for it, which had surprised Silas and pleased Edwin. In November, the weather turned serious. The first hard frost came on a Wednesday, and the second came that Saturday, and Edwin arrived on Sunday morning rather than afternoon, because he had something he needed to say and could not wait until afternoon to say it, which was so unlike his usual unhurried manner that Lavinia came to the door and felt her heart give one hard knock against her ribs before she had even heard what he had to say. "The hands I hired are from town," he said, standing on her porch without his hat in the cold because he had taken it off instinctively and not thought to put it back. "And town knows about Sunday. They are talking Lavinia." He had stopped using Mrs. Wainwright somewhere around the third Sunday without either of them making a formal agreement about it, and she had noticed and allowed it because she wanted him to use her name in that way, simply, and as if it belonged in his mouth. "They would be," she said. "What are they saying?" "The charitable version is that I am a newcomer who does not know what he has gotten involved with," he said, and his voice had a careful steadiness in it that told her this had cost him something to come here and say. "The uncharitable version I will not repeat." "I know the uncharitable version," she said. "I have been living in it for 2 years." He looked at her. "I need you to know that neither version changes anything for me," he said. "I'm not a man who makes a habit of telling people what they want to hear. I am telling you what is true. I want to keep coming here on Sundays and on other days besides Sundays, and I want that not to be a secret even though it is not a secret that costs me anything personally. I just want to be clear that I know what is being said and I am here anyway." "Edwin," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I have never been good at avoiding," he said, and there was something raw and simple in it, the admission of a nature, not a boast. "When something matters to me, I go toward it. That is just what I do." She stood in the cold morning looking at him, this man who had ridden into her town and taken a flour sack out of her arms and listened to everything she said, and built a house 30 yards south and east of where he had originally planned because she told him to. And she felt the fire in her chest that she had been carefully not tending for 6 weeks roar up without her permission and become something that was not careful at all. "Come inside," she said. "It is cold and you left your hat on my porch." He came inside. He picked up his hat. She made coffee and they sat at her kitchen table and she told him the truth about Randall. She told it plainly and without drama, the way she did everything. Randall Wainwright had been charming when she met him and had married her when she was 24 and he was 36, and it had been apparent within the first year that the charm was a surface condition, and underneath it was a man who believed that what he owned belonged to him completely, including his wife. He had not been violent in the physical sense. He had been violent in other ways, the kind that leave no marks that a doctor can write down, the kind that work on a person's sense of themselves like water on stone, slow and constant, and eventually erosive. She had stayed because leaving was not a simple thing in 1876 for a woman with no independent means, and because she had believed for a long time that if she was patient enough and good enough the man she had thought she married would come back. He had not come back. He had gotten harder. He had died, as the doctor said, from the fall. She had been in the kitchen when it happened, and the hired hand Cassidy had come running to tell her, and she had gone to him and he had already been gone. She had felt grief. She had felt it for the man she had thought he was and for the marriage she had hoped she could have. She had not felt grief for the man he had actually been, and she was not capable of performing a grief she did not have, which was why she had stood straight-backed at the funeral with dry eyes, and the town had decided what it decided. Edwin listened to all of this without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I am sorry that was your life for 7 years. Not I am sorry for your loss, not a version that made Randall's death the center of the sorrow. He was sorry that had been her life. The precision of it hit her somewhere between the ribs. I am building something different now," she said. "I can see that," he said. "You have been building it since the day after he died." She looked at her coffee cup. "You said you have never been good at avoiding," she said. "That is true," he said. "I want you to understand what you are not avoiding," she said, looking up at him. "Not just the gossip, me. A woman who is 31 and has been running her own ranch for 2 years and has specific opinions about everything from water rights to where shelves should be hung, and who is not going to be any different from what she is." "Lavinia," he said, and the way he said her name now was different from the way he had said it before, warmer and more particular, like a thing he was claiming. "Those are not the reasons I would need to be warned off. Those are the reasons I am here." The winter came in earnest in December, and Edwin's house was close enough to finish that he moved into it, sleeping on a bedroll at first, and then with a proper bed when the furniture wagon came down from Abilene. The house was small and solid and smelled of new wood, and it was warm because he had built the fireplace according to a plan that Lavinia had suggested, wide and deep, drawing well. He had dinner at the Wainwright Ranch twice a week now, Sundays as always and Thursdays besides, and she had ridden over to his land twice to look at how the house was coming along and give opinions that he had solicited and acted on. And on one of those visits he had kissed her, standing in the doorway of his new house with the December wind behind her and the firelight in front of them. and it had been the kind of kiss that is not tentative, not a question, but is also not a demand. It was an arrival. It was two people who had been moving toward each other finally being in the same place. She had ridden home afterward in the cold and dark and felt more alive than she had felt in years. The town of Caldwell Creek was not quiet about any of this. The talk had intensified from background noise to active commentary, and it reached Edwin through his hired men and through Mrs. Albrecht, who reported it to him without editorializing because she believed he had a right to the information and the intelligence to do with it what was sensible. It reached Lavinia through the change in how she was treated at the general store, which went from cool neutrality to something chillier, and through a conversation she overheard between two women at the dry goods counter who did not realize she was on the other side of the shelving. "She has gotten her claws into the Yates man," one of them said. "Poor fool does not know what she is." "He will learn," the other said. Lavinia picked up her purchase and walked around the end of the shelving and looked at them, both of them, and said in a perfectly level voice, "Good morning, Mrs. Howell, Mrs. Crane," and she walked out of the store. She told Edwin about it that Sunday at dinner, not because she was wounded by it, but because she believed in giving him accurate information about the terrain. He listened, and something moved across his face that was not anger exactly, but was its quiet cousin, a settled and immovable kind of displeasure. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "I have found that drama rewards the people who started it. I want to just be what I am consistently until it becomes undeniable." "What are you?" he asked, and he meant it as a genuine question. She thought about it seriously. "Honest," she said. "A good rancher. A woman who survived something and came out knowing her own mind. Someone who is, I am finding, capable of caring a great deal about a specific person, which I had not expected to discover again." He reached across the kitchen table and took her hand, which was a small gesture and a large one at the same time. "The town will come around," he said, "or it will not. Either way, you are going to be all right." "I know that," she said. "I have known that for 2 years. What I did not know was that all right might also get to be good." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it, the roughness of it, the capable and work-worn quality of it that was nothing like what a lady's hand was supposed to look like and was everything like what a rancher's hand looked like. He brought it to his mouth and kissed her knuckles, slowly, looking at her while he did it, and Lavinia Wainwright felt heat move from her hand up her arm and into her chest and sit there like a coal. Christmas came and brought a hard freeze and 3 days of snow, which was not unprecedented in Kansas in December, but was always dramatic. The white sky and white ground, and the smoke going straight up from every chimney in the county. Edwin spent the worst 2 days of it at the Wainwright Ranch because it was impractical to go back across the open range in that weather, and he slept in the spare room, which Lavinia had made up properly with clean linens and a good quilt, and in the mornings they made breakfast together in her kitchen, and the domestic simplicity of it was startling in its rightness. On the 3rd morning, when the snow had gentled enough to see the horizon again, they stood on the porch with coffee and watched the white world come back into color as the sun came up, and Edwin said, without looking away from the horizon, "I have been thinking about a thing." "Tell me," she said. "I would like to marry you," he said. "Not because it is the proper resolution to the situation, but because the thought of you being in someone else's kitchen with someone else's snow outside, and someone else making you coffee in the morning is something I find genuinely intolerable." She looked at him. He was still watching the horizon, and she could see his jaw was set in the way it got when he was saying something that cost him some of his usual composure. "That is a particular reason," she said. "There are others," he said. "I could list them. They are all specific. None of them are about the ranch or the land or anything practical. They are all about you, Lavinia, specifically and entirely you." She turned back to the horizon. The sun was coming fully up now, gold on the white fields, the sky the clean, washed blue that only happens after weather. "The town will say you married me for the land," she said. "I have my own land," he said. "They will say other things as well." "They will," he said, "and they will be wrong as they have been wrong about you for 2 years, and we will continue to know what is actually true, and they will eventually run out of things to say." She was quiet for a long moment. A hawk went over, riding the cold air above the snow, unhurried and certain of itself, and she watched it until it was a speck and then gone. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. "Yes. To your question," she said. "Yes." He set his coffee cup on the porch rail and turned to her fully and took her face in his hands. And the kiss he gave her then was different from the ones before, longer and more deliberate, and carrying in it everything that had been building since October on the steps of the general store. And Lavinia put her hands on his chest and felt his heartbeat going as fast as hers. They were married in February of 1879, in the smallest legal ceremony available in Caldwell Creek, which was to say in front of the county judge with Mrs. Albrecht and Tom Briley as witnesses, and Lavinia wore her good gray dress and Edwin wore a clean coat he had ordered from the catalog. And it was not elaborate, but it was absolutely real. And when the judge pronounced them married, Edwin looked at Lavinia with an expression so unguarded and full that Mrs. Albrecht, who was not a sentimental woman by any description, had to look at the ceiling for a moment. The town reacted the way small towns react to things that confound their existing narratives, which was to say, with a period of increased gossip, followed by a gradual and reluctant recalibration. The fact that Edwin Yates was a solid and respectable man with paid land and no debts, and the goodwill of Silas Greer, and the Haverson family made it difficult to maintain the position that Lavinia was simply victimizing another man. The fact that the Wainwright ranch continued to be well-run and profitable, and that Lavinia continued to pay her debts and deal squarely with the businesses in town, made it gradually harder to sustain the idea that she was anything other than what she appeared to be. Mrs. Howell remained cool. Mrs. Crane remained cool, but 3 other women in town, led by Mrs. Albrecht, were warm, and warmth tends to spread faster than coolness in a place where people depend on each other's goodwill to survive a Kansas winter. Edwin moved the majority of his operations to the Wainwright Ranch, because it was the larger and more established property, and his own land became a satellite operation, a grazing range for additional cattle with a small crew to manage it. He and Tom Briley spent the first month working out a new structure, and Tom's final assessment, delivered as usual to the middle distance, was that Edwin Yates appeared to understand cattle, which was the highest compliment Tom Briley dispensed. Spring came to Kansas in a rush of mud and green, the way it always does after a hard winter, as if the land is making up for lost time. The cattle were fat from the hay stores they had laid in during December. The new calves were coming in strong numbers, and Lavinia walked the fences of the ranch in the April morning with a clipboard and a pencil, making notes with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose plan is working. Edwin rode up behind her on Fletcher one morning early, when the dew was still on the grass, and the meadowlarks were very loud about the business of being meadowlarks. "The south pasture fence needs new posts in 3 sections," she said without turning around, because she had heard Fletcher's hoofbeats and knew the particular rhythm of them by now. "I know," he said. "I was out there at first light. I marked them." He swung down from the horse and fell into step beside her. "The calves in the east field are coming along. 23 new calves in 3 weeks," she said. "It is going to be a strong year." He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her, and she glanced at him and saw that expression again, the open one, the one he wore when he was about to say something that mattered. "What?" she said. "I was thinking," he said, "about whether the ranch house has enough rooms." She stopped walking. She looked at him. "I want children," he said simply, the way he said everything important. "I want children with you if you want that. I did not have them before, and I am 34, and I am aware that is not young, but it is not old either, and I find that I want a family more than I have wanted most things." Lavinia considered the ranch house behind her, the house she had made her own with the window and the shelves and the right-sized table. It had 4 rooms besides the kitchen. There were currently 2 people in it. "There are enough rooms," she said. "There would need to be more eventually, but there is space to add them." "Is that a yes?" "Edwin," she said, and the way she said his name carried everything in it, warmth and certainty and a deep abiding gladness. "It is a yes." He picked her up then, right there in the April meadow with her clipboard and pencil, and the meadowlarks complaining about the disruption. And she laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that surprised her, full and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who had not had enough occasions for that kind of laugh in a very long time. Their first child was born in January of 1880, a boy they named James, after Edwin's father, who had been a good man and a hard worker in Tennessee before the war had rearranged everything. James Yates came into the world on a cold and clear night with Mrs. Albrecht serving as midwife, and Edwin spent the hours of the labor sitting just outside the bedroom door, because he could not bring himself to be farther away than that. And when the baby's first cry came through the door, he put his forehead against the wall and breathed. Lavinia held her son in the lamplight and felt something settle in her that she had not known was unsettled, a deep and final claim on the life she had been building since Randall died, the proof that the future was going to be genuinely different from the past. Edwin came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at James, who was red-faced and loud and perfect, and then looked at Lavinia, who was exhausted and luminous and looking at the baby with an expression that Edwin would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. "James," she said softly, trying the name. "James," Edwin agreed. Tom Briley came by the next morning and stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and said, to the window, that the cattle in the east field looked to be doing well, and also that the Yates family appeared to be off to a fine start, and went back out without elaborating, which was precisely as much as Tom Briley could be expected to say about anything emotional, and Lavinia and Edwin both understood it as the benediction it was. The spring of 1880 brought changes to Caldwell Creek beyond the Yates household. The railroad, which had been the great transformer of Kansas since the late 1860s, was extending a spur line that would come within 12 miles of town, which meant the cattle operation in the area was going to become both more profitable and more competitive as access to eastern markets improved. Edwin saw this clearly and spent the spring and summer negotiating with 2 neighboring ranchers to form a cooperative arrangement for the cattle drive to the railhead, which benefited everyone involved and established him firmly in the community's economic structure. This was not small. Being economically connected to other ranchers in the area meant being socially connected, which meant that the social position of Lavinia Yates, which was what people had begun calling her now, was carried upward by the cooperative arrangement in ways that no amount of good behavior alone would have achieved. The frontier was pragmatic. When a woman's husband was essential to your livelihood, you found ways to make peace with the woman. Mrs. Howell's thawing came first, in the form of a comment to Mrs. Albrecht that the Yates Ranch appeared to be running very efficiently, which was Mrs. Howell's version of a peace treaty. Mrs. Crane came around at the church social in August, when Lavinia brought a cherry pie that was so good that Mrs. Crane asked for the recipe, and asking for someone's recipe is an act of social capitulation that is irreversible once committed. Lavinia gave her the recipe without any of the satisfaction she might have been entitled to show, because she was not interested in winning a social war. She was interested in living her life, and her life was very full. James was a round and energetic baby who became a toddler with strong opinions and a particular attachment to the horses, which he expressed from the age of 14 months by making extremely urgent sounds in the direction of the corral, until someone took him close enough to touch the fence. Edwin watched this development with the expression of a man who has discovered an unexpected and complete happiness. "He is going to be a writer," Edwin told Tom Briley, who looked at the small and insistent James and said to the corral fence that it appeared that way. In the summer of 1881, Lavinia knew she was expecting again, and she told Edwin on a Thursday evening after dinner, sitting at her kitchen table with the summer light coming long and gold through her north side window, and he received the news the way he received most news, with quietness, and then a warmth that expanded outward from the center of him until it was visible on his face like sunrise. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. "The house has enough rooms," he said, because they had added 2 rooms in the spring in anticipation. "Plenty of rooms," she agreed. The second child, born in February of 1882, was a girl they named Clara, and she came into the world with her mother's dark hair and her father's still and observant quality, looking around the room with the focused attention of someone who intends to take thorough notes. James, who was just over 2, was brought in to meet his sister, and stood next to the bed looking at her with an expression of profound and somewhat skeptical interest. "That is your sister," Lavinia told him. "Her name is Clara." James considered Clara for a long moment and then reached out one careful finger and touched her hand, and Clara's hand wrapped around his finger with the instinctive grip of newborns, and James looked up at his mother with an expression of complete astonishment. "She is strong," Edwin said, smiling. "She is a Yates," Lavinia said. "They are a stubborn lot." Edwin looked at her with that open, warm expression. "Present company included." "Particularly present company," she said. The ranch continued to expand and improve through the early 1880s. Edwin's original 180 acres had been consolidated with the Wainwright property, and together they ran a cattle operation that was among the 3 or 4 most productive in the county. The cooperative arrangement with the neighboring ranches was working well. The railroad spur had opened and was running cattle efficiently to the eastern markets, and the financial position of the family was solid and growing more solid. Tom Briley had been promoted to head foreman across the combined operation, a position he accepted with the same dignified restraint he applied to everything, and he managed it with the skill of a man who has been doing this work for 30 years and knows every aspect of it deeply. Edwin had also hired a young man named Caleb Marsh, 20 years old and recently arrived from Missouri, who had the kind of energy and willingness to learn that reminded Edwin of himself at that age, and he was teaching Caleb with the same patient thoroughness that he had applied to learning from the experienced trail drivers who had taught him. It was Caleb who brought the news one morning in October of 1882 that a man was asking around town about the Wainwright Ranch, specifically about the circumstances of Randall Wainwright's death. Caleb reported this with the loyalty of someone who understood that the information was important and the careful manner of someone who did not know exactly what it meant. Edwin thanked him and went to find Lavinia. She was in the north pasture checking a fence line, and he rode out to her and told her what Caleb had said, watching her face as he did. She went very still in the way she had, the stillness of a person gathering themselves. "Did Caleb get a name?" she asked. "Harlan Wainwright," he said. "Randall's brother from St. Louis." She was quiet for a moment. She had known about Harlan, a man she had met twice in 7 years of marriage, who had disapproved of Randall's marriage to her from the beginning, and had made that disapproval known in the way that certain men make things known, with money and lawyers and carefully constructed suggestions. "What does he want?" she asked, though she could guess. "Caleb does not know, but he was at the county clerk's office this morning looking at the property records." Lavinia looked out across the north pasture at the cattle moving slow and steady in the October morning, and then she looked back at Edwin. "He thinks there is a claim on this property," she said. "He has thought so since Randall died. He wrote me a letter in 1877 suggesting that Randall had intended to restructure the deed before his death. It was nonsense. The deed was clear and straightforward, and the lawyer confirmed it." "He may have found a different lawyer," Edwin said. "Then we find a better one," she said, with a quietness that was not resignation but its opposite. "This is our ranch." James and Clara are going to grow up here. I will not allow Harlan Wainwright to use the law as a tool to take from us what we have built." Edwin looked at her, his wife, standing in the October field with the same straight back she had carried through 2 years of widowhood and the town's hostility and everything the frontier could throw at her, and felt something fierce and uncomplicated move through him. "No," he agreed, "we will not." They rode into Caldwell Creek that afternoon and retained the services of Martin Holt, who was the best lawyer in the county, and had the reputation of a man who won his cases, because he understood the law very precisely and did not allow other people's cleverness to substitute for knowledge. Holt examined the deed, the original purchase records, Randall's will, and the letter from Harlan Wainwright, and gave his assessment across the desk of his small office with the directness of a man billing by the hour. "The claim has no legal foundation," he said. "The deed was properly recorded and has been in your name since before Randall's death, jointly, and transferred fully to you at his death according to the will. Harlan Wainwright may contest the will, but the will was properly witnessed and filed, and the grounds for contest are extremely narrow. He would need to demonstrate incapacity or undue influence, neither of which he can do because there is no evidence for either." "Then why is he here?" Edwin asked. "Because some men," Holt said, looking at Lavinia specifically, "believe that a woman alone is easier to pressure than to beat in court. He may be testing to see whether you will settle something rather than fight him." "I will not settle," Lavinia said. "I did not think you would," Holt said with a small and approving smile. "I will write to him and make the legal position clear. If he persists, we will address it in court and we will win." Harlan Wainwright's lawyer received Holt's letter, and after a period of silence that lasted 3 weeks, during which Lavinia went about her daily work with exactly the same steadiness she always had, sent a reply that conceded the legal point and stated that Harlan did not intend to pursue the matter further. It was not an apology. It was a retreat, and retreat was enough. Edwin burned the letter in the kitchen stove that evening, and Lavinia watched it go with a sense of finality that was deeply satisfying. "Is there anything else from the past that is going to come for us?" he asked, not sharply but with genuine curiosity, as a man taking stock of the terrain. She thought about it honestly. "I do not believe so," she said. "Harlan was the last of it." "Then we are finished with all of that," he said. "We have been finished with it for a while," she said. "It just took everyone else some time to notice." He laughed at that, the warm and genuine laugh she had grown to love in the past 4 years, and she smiled across the kitchen table at him in the lamplight. And James, who was nearly 3 now, came padding in from the bedroom in his nightclothes demanding water, and Edwin got up and got water and carried the boy back to bed, and Lavinia listened to the low murmur of Edwin's voice telling James something about stars, because James had recently become interested in stars. And the house was warm and quiet and entirely her own. The years that followed were the years of building in every sense. The ranch grew. The children grew. James became a boy who rode almost before he could walk, fearless on horseback in the way that children who are raised on ranches sometimes are. And Clara became a girl who asked questions about everything, precise and relentless questions that drove Lavinia to find answers she had not previously sought, which she found she enjoyed. Edwin taught James to rope at age 6, a process that took most of a summer, and produced a quantity of missed loops and frustrated sounds that could be heard from the kitchen window, where Lavinia occasionally watched while pretending not to. By the end of the summer, James could rope a fence post reliably, which Edwin declared a success with the gravity of a man announcing a military victory. Clara learned to read at age 4, sitting in Lavinia's lap with one of the 3 books Lavinia owned, and reading gave way to the ambition to write. And by age 6, Clara was producing small documents with the stub of a pencil that she treated with the seriousness of official correspondence. Edwin kept a stack of these documents in the desk in his office and referred to them as the ranch archives, which Clara found appropriate. In 1884, the little school in Caldwell Creek, which had been operating irregularly with whatever teacher could be retained for more than one academic year, hired a permanent school teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Prescott, who had come west with the specific intention of establishing a proper education for frontier children, and she was excellent. James and Clara both went, and both came home with the particular brightness of children who are finding the world more interesting than they had previously known. Lavinia served on the school board, which she had been asked to do by the town council, and accepted, because it mattered to her that the school be properly funded and run. She served with the same competence she brought to everything, and the other board members, who had initially been uncertain about having Lavinia Yates among them, found within the first term that she was the most organized and effective member they had, which resolved their uncertainty efficiently. Mrs. Howell, also on the board, became, over the course of 2 years of shared committee work, something approaching a genuine ally. It was not a warm friendship. Lavinia did not particularly require warm friendships with people who had spent years being cruel to her, but it was a working respect, and working respect in a town like Caldwell Creek was a functional and valuable thing. Edwin and Tom Briley expanded the cattle operation in 1885 to include a relationship with a buyer in Kansas City who was paying premium prices for high-quality beef, which required them to be more selective in their breeding and more careful in their fattening, both of which suited the way Lavinia had always preferred to run the operation anyway. The premium prices made the quality investment worthwhile in a way that silenced any skeptics among the neighboring ranchers in approximately one shipping season. Caleb Marsh, who had been with them since 1882, married a local girl named Ruth in the spring of 1885, and Edwin and Lavinia hosted the wedding celebration at the ranch, which was the largest social event the property had seen in its history. Lavinia cooked enough food for 40 people, and Edwin contributed a barrel of cider he had acquired from a farm east of town, and Tom Briley sat in a corner of the yard and watched the proceedings with an expression that anyone who knew him could identify as contentment, which on Tom's face was as exuberant as most people got with a full smile. James was 5 and Clara was 3 at the wedding, and James ate so much pie that he had to be carried to bed, which Edwin did with the ease of a man who has been carrying a child to bed for 5 years and finds it no imposition. "He is going to wake up in the night," Lavinia said, watching Edwin settle the boy. "He will wake up," Edwin agreed, "and I will be awake too because I always am when he is, and we will deal with it then." She looked at him in the doorway of the children's room, her husband, this man who had ridden into Caldwell Creek with trail dust on his coat and taken a flour sack out of her arms, and the fullness of what her life had become was so enormous sometimes that it was hard to look at directly. "Edwin," she said quietly. He turned from the sleeping James and looked at her in the dim lamplight. "What?" "I am glad you are not good at avoiding," she said. He came to her in the doorway and put his hands on her face and kissed her forehead, slowly and with great deliberateness, and then her nose, and then her mouth, and she laughed against his lips. "Lavinia," he murmured. "What?" she said. "I am also very glad," he said. The third child came in 1886, another boy they named Robert, after a friend of Edwin's from the trail driving years who had died of a fever in the winter of 1876, and whose memory Edwin had been carrying ever since. Robert came out loud and emphatic and very red, and James, who was 6, and Clara, who was 4, were brought in to inspect him with a degree of ceremony that Lavinia organized, because she had learned from the Clara introduction that ceremony helped James take these things seriously. James looked at Robert and announced that he was loud, which was accurate, and Clara asked whether he was going to get teeth soon, which revealed that she had been thinking about what babies lacked and wanted to know the timeline. Edwin explained the dental situation with more thoroughness than the question strictly required, because Edwin enjoyed explaining things to his children and took no question they asked as too small to deserve a complete answer. Mrs. Albrecht came to see the baby and sat in the kitchen with Lavinia for 2 hours, and they talked the way they had come to talk over the years, honestly and without performing any particular version of themselves. And when Mrs. Albrecht left, she held Lavinia's hand at the door and said, "You have done very well, my dear," and Lavinia, who almost never cried, felt her eyes sting. "You helped," Lavinia said. "I told the truth about you," Mrs. Albrecht said. "That is not help, that is just decency. You did the rest." The late 1880s in Kansas brought both prosperity and challenge. The cattle market fluctuated with the Eastern economy, and there were years when the margins were thinner than anyone preferred. But the Yates operation was well managed enough to absorb the variations without crisis, which was more than some of their neighbors could say. 2 smaller ranches in the county failed during the difficult market years of 1887 and 1888, and Edwin and Lavinia bought portions of both properties at fair prices, which expanded their range further and allowed them to maintain their herd numbers through the lean period by having more grazing land to work with. Lavinia handled the financial negotiations for these purchases herself, sitting across the desk from bankers and lawyers with her records and her calculations, and not one of these transactions went badly because she was meticulous and she understood leverage without being cruel about it. She paid fair prices. She did not squeeze. This had consequences for her reputation that Mrs. Howell's eventual conversion and the school board service had not quite completed, which was that the business community of Caldwell Creek and the surrounding county came to regard Lavinia Yates as not merely respectable but genuinely formidable in the best sense, the kind of person you wanted to do business with rather than against. Edwin was proud of her in the way that only a man who has no anxiety about his wife's competence can be proud, completely and openly, telling anyone who asked that Lavinia ran the financial side of the operation and that the operation was profitable because of it. Some men in town found this remarkable. Edwin found it simply accurate. Tom Briley retired in 1889 at the age of 63, with a pension that Edwin and Lavinia had arranged over Tom's initial protests and eventual acceptance, and he moved into a small house in Caldwell Creek, where he could be seen most mornings sitting on his front porch watching the main street of the town, with the same evaluating expression he had always turned on cattle and fence lines and new employees. Edwin visited him every week and Lavinia sent food regularly, and Tom received all of this with dignity and something that was extremely close to gratitude. Caleb Marsh, by then 29 and with 3 years of additional experience under his belt, stepped into the head foreman position and was excellent at it. He had learned his ranching from Tom and Edwin both, and the combination had produced a foreman who was practically capable and organizationally solid, and the transition was smoother than any of them had feared it might be. James was 9 in 1889, Clara was 7, and Robert was 3, and the ranch was loud with children and working dogs and horses and the general productive noise of a large operation running well. The house had been expanded twice since the original building, and it was now a proper ranch house with a wide front porch that Lavinia had planted with climbing roses, which bloomed in June in a way that was almost extravagant against the Kansas sky. Edwin built a porch swing for the east side of the house, where the morning light came, and on Sunday mornings after the children were older and could be trusted to handle their own breakfast, Edwin and Lavinia sat in that swing with coffee and watched the morning come over the range. And those quiet Sunday mornings were among the things that Edwin, if he was being precise about it, loved most in his life. He told her this one Sunday in the summer of 1890, sitting in the swing with their coffee, the horses moving in the far pasture and the meadowlarks making their usual emphatic statements about the beauty of June. "Of all of it," he said, "this is the part I would choose to keep if I could only keep one part." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "The swing. This morning," he said. "You hear coffee, that view. If I could only save one thing from everything we have built, this is what I would save." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are a romantic, Edwin Yates." "I have been accused of worse," he said. "Not by me," she said. He reached over and took her hand, which was something he had done 10,000 times in 12 years of marriage, and which still carried in it something that was not habit but was deeper than habit, the particular specific warmth of this hand in his, her calluses and her capable fingers and the plain gold ring she wore. "Are you happy?" he asked. She looked at the range and the horses and the June sky. She felt the swing moving slightly in the morning breeze, and the warmth of the sun coming up and the coffee in her hand, and his hand in her other hand. She thought about a woman standing in a cold kitchen in 1876 trying to understand how she had ended up in a life that did not fit, and about a woman standing on a porch in December of 1878 watching a man ride away in the dusk, and feeling something warm and frightening catch fire in her chest. "I am very happy," she said, and the simplicity of it was the most complete thing she had ever said. They sat in the swing until the children came tumbling out of the house looking for breakfast, and the day began in earnest around them, loud and specific and full, the way days were on the Yates ranch. In 1891, Clara discovered that she wanted to be a doctor. She was 9 years old, and she made this announcement at the dinner table with the same directness her mother had always used for important statements, and Edwin put his fork down and looked at her with complete seriousness. "Why?" he asked. "Because sick people need help," Clara said, "and I am good at figuring things out, and Miss Prescott says there are women doctors in the East now, and there will be more." "Miss Prescott is correct," Lavinia said from her end of the table, and met Edwin's eyes with an expression that was half pride and half the delighted recognition of a woman seeing her own nature in her daughter. "Women doctors," James said at 11 with the tone of a boy who is not sure how he feels about this. "James," Edwin said, "your sister is smarter than you." James considered this. "Yes," he said with the grudging honesty of an older brother who cannot actually argue the point. "She probably is." Robert, had no opinion on the matter but ate another biscuit, which was its own kind of statement. Lavinia began acquiring medical texts through the mail-order catalog from back east, a process that took months, and produced a growing stack of books that Clara read, with the focused devotion of someone preparing for a mission. Edwin took Clara to visit the town doctor, Dr. Aldrich, who was 60 and nearing the end of his practice, and received Clara's questions about medicine and anatomy with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who has been practicing in isolation and is delighted to find an earnest young mind interested in his work. She should go east, Dr. Aldrich told Edwin, after Clara had left his office with a pamphlet about medicine. "For proper training. There are medical schools now that will take women. She has the mind for it." Edwin reported this to Lavinia that evening, and they discussed it the way they discussed everything important, directly and completely, covering the practicalities and the feelings both. "It is a long way away," Edwin said. "And a long time." "Yes," Lavinia said, "and she is 9. She will not go at 9, Lavinia said, "but we should plan as if she will go because she will." "Then we plan," he said. They began, quietly, setting aside funds specifically designated for Clara's education, which was something not many cattle ranching families in Kansas were doing for their daughters in 1891. But the Yates family was not many cattle ranching families in Kansas, and both Edwin and Lavinia knew it. The 1890s brought the frontier era that had defined their world to a gradual close. The open range that Edwin had spent 12 years driving cattle across was being sectioned and fenced. The great cattle trails north were giving way to the railroad network that moved cattle more efficiently if less dramatically. And the frontier quality of life in places like Caldwell Creek was shifting towards something that was more settled and institutional, which brought its advantages and its losses. The men who had defined themselves entirely by the open range era, The trail drivers and the cowboys who needed the wide, unfenced miles to be what they were had to adapt or move on. Some moved on. Edwin adapted, as he had always adapted, by understanding what the new thing required and giving it his complete attention. He talked sometimes, on the porch swing in the morning, about the trail drives. Not with nostalgia exactly, but with the honest acknowledgement of a man who knew that a chapter of his life had been genuinely remarkable even when it had been genuinely hard. "I was 22 the first time I drove cattle north," he said one morning in the summer of 1893. "I did not know anything. The trail boss, a man named Calhoun, had no patience for ignorance but a great deal of patience for someone willing to learn. He taught me everything I know about reading weather and reading cattle." "Where is he now?" Lavinia asked. "Retired," Edwin said. "Last I heard, living with his daughter in Texas. He would be 70 now." "You should write to him," she said. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because he taught you things that built this," she said, gesturing outward at the ranch and the range and the children's voices coming from inside the house. "He deserves to know what his teaching made." Edwin was quiet for a moment. "That is a good thought," he said. He wrote the letter, and Calhoun wrote back, and they exchanged 3 letters over the following year before Calhoun died in the spring of 1895, and Edwin had the letters saved in the same desk drawer with Clara's small official documents from childhood. James, at 15, was clearly going to be a rancher. He had the physical ease with livestock and the instinctive reading of weather and terrain that Edwin had always thought was partly teachable and partly something a person simply had, and James had it in full measure. He was working alongside Caleb Marsh now, real work rather than the instructional version, and Caleb reported that James had better hands than any boy he had seen, which Edwin received with the particular pleasure of a parent who recognizes something of themselves and something beyond themselves both. Robert, at 9, was quieter than his siblings, an observer, a boy who watched the world before he participated in it, which Lavinia recognized as the same quality Edwin had, and which she found in a child both fascinating and occasionally amusing. Robert had a talent for drawing, which had manifested early, and was now producing careful and accurate sketches of horses and buildings and landscapes that Edwin had hung in the hallway of the ranch house with the same seriousness with which he had kept Clara's documents. Clara, at 13, had read every medical text they had been able to acquire and was corresponding by letter with a young woman doctor in Cincinnati, who had agreed to answer her questions after receiving a letter from Clara that was apparently impressive enough in its precision and seriousness to warrant the response. Lavinia had read the letter before it was sent and had felt a specific and enormous pride that she had expressed, privately, to Edwin and to no one else. The turn of the century, when it came in 1900, was both larger and smaller than the approaching of it had felt. The world did not transform overnight. The seasons still came and went over the Kansas range with the same indifference to human calendar keeping that they had always had. The cattle still needed water and grass, and the specific attentive care that separated a good operation from a poor one. The morning light still came over the east pasture in the same gold wash that it had always come. What changed was smaller and larger than the landscape. The children were grown, or nearly so. James was 20, working the ranch with a confidence and competence that made Edwin feel the satisfaction of a thing properly made. Clara was 18 and had been accepted to a women's medical college in Philadelphia, which was real and not theoretical, and would leave in September, and Lavinia was carrying this fact with the careful composure of a woman who is very proud and also very aware that the distance between Kansas and Philadelphia is enormous. Robert was 14, still drawing, still watching, still the quietest of the 3, and in his quietness perhaps the most deeply his own self. Edwin was 56. Lavinia was 53. Neither of them felt old, which was something they had discussed with mild surprise, the discovery that time had passed so substantially without the sense of accumulation that they had perhaps expected. They were the same people. They were more themselves than they had ever been. The Sunday morning before Clara was to leave for Philadelphia, all five of them sat together on the front porch of the Yates ranch house, in the August heat with lemonade and the particular silence that comes before a departure. The climbing roses had gone over for the year, but the vines were heavy and green on the porch rails, and the morning was already warm and the sky was that impossible clean Kansas blue. Clara sat on the top porch step with her hands around her lemonade glass and looked out at the range. She had been quiet all morning, which for Clara was notable and meant she was processing something too large for her usual rapid speech. "I am going to come back," she said finally, without turning around. "When I am finished, there are not enough doctors in this county. I am going to come back and be one." "I know," Lavinia said. "You are not worried I will find it too interesting back east and stay there?" "No," Lavinia said. Clara turned then and looked at her mother. "Why not?" "Because you are mine," Lavinia said simply. "And mine come home." Edwin, sitting in the porch swing with his coffee, said nothing because he did not need to, and James, sitting in the chair nearest the door, looked at his boots, and Robert, on the other end of the porch step from Clara, offered her his lemonade because hers was almost empty, which was Robert's way of saying everything he was feeling without saying it. Clara left for Philadelphia in September, and the house was perceptibly quieter, and Lavinia wrote her a letter every week without fail, practical letters full of ranch news and family detail. And Clara wrote back with letters full of medical information and observations about Philadelphia that made them laugh and made them miss her in equal measure. James took on more formal management of the cattle operation that autumn, working with Caleb Marsh in the division of responsibilities that was the natural next step of things. And Edwin stepped back slightly, not out of retirement, but out of the deliberate choice of a man who has built something and is ready to let the next hands carry it forward. He spent more time with Robert, walking the range in the mornings, sitting with him while Robert drew, telling him stories about the trail drive years and the early days of the ranch. Robert listened with the complete attention that was his particular gift, and occasionally asked questions that were so precisely pointed that Edwin stopped and looked at his youngest son with the specific wonder of discovering who a person is. "Did you love this land when you first bought it?" Robert asked one morning, sitting on the rise that Edwin had originally stood on when he had bought the property in 1878, the rise that was now part of the combined Yates range. "No," Edwin said honestly. "I thought it was good land. I thought it could be what I needed. Love came later." "When?" Edwin thought about it. "When it was ours," he said. "Not mine, ours. When your mother had been walking it and working it alongside me, and when James was born and we brought him out to the porch for the first time and the whole ranch looked different because it was his too. Love is like that. It comes after you have put something into a place, not before." Robert wrote this down in a small notebook he kept. Edwin noticed and said nothing, but he felt that particular fullness in his chest that he associated with his children doing things that made him certain they were going to be all right. In 1905, Clara came home. She was 23 years old, Dr. Clara Yates, and she came on the train from Kansas City, and James and Robert drove the wagon to meet her and brought her back to the ranch. And Lavinia was standing on the porch when the wagon came up the road, and Clara climbed down from the seat before it had fully stopped and walked, very fast, and then ran the last few steps to her mother. Lavinia held her doctor daughter, and felt 23 years of this child's life in the holding of her, and did not cry only because Clara was crying enough for both of them. Edwin came out of the house and stood on the porch and watched his wife and his youngest daughter, and James stood by the wagon with his arms crossed and his jaw working, and Robert watched it all and afterward made a drawing of it that he gave to Lavinia and that she kept for the rest of her life. Clara set up a practice in Caldwell Creek the following spring, in a small office on the main street of town, and was the first doctor in the county with a medical college degree in 15 years, since old Dr. Aldrich had died in 1898, and the first woman doctor in the county's history. The initial skepticism, which was real, lasted approximately as long as it took for Clara to correctly diagnose a condition that had been troubling one of the town's leading families for 6 months and prescribe a treatment that worked within 3 weeks, at which point the skepticism dissolved into the pragmatic acceptance that the frontier had always reserved for people who could do what needed doing. She was very good at it. She was her mother's daughter, precise and composed and competent, and she was her father's daughter too, patient and direct and committed to doing things properly. Edwin and Lavinia watched all of this from the porch swing on Sunday mornings with their coffee and the meadowlarks and the morning light coming over the east pasture. "She is going to be remarkable," Edwin said, one Sunday in the summer of 1906. "She already is," Lavinia said. "Like her mother," he said. "Like her parents," she said, which was the precise and correct thing to say. He took her hand in the swing and they were quiet together for a while, and the morning was warm and clear, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture, and somewhere inside the house Robert was drawing something and James was probably already out working, because James was always already out working, and Clara's office in town had a lamp burning already because Clara started early. "Edwin," Lavinia said. "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," he said. She looked at the ranch, their ranch, the pastures and the outbuildings and the fences in good repair and the house with its climbing roses and the porch swing he had built. And she thought about the woman she had been in 1878, carrying flour sacks and bracing herself against a town that had decided what she was, and the man who had taken the flour sack out of her arms without asking and walked beside her, as if walking beside her was simply the practical thing to do. "I was thinking," she said, "that I want to have this for another 30 years. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "We have to want the same things." "We do," she said. "We always have." He turned to look at her, his wife of 27 years, who had the same dark hair now silvered at the temples and the same sharp eyes, and the same quality of absolute presence that had stopped him on the main street of Caldwell Creek in October of 1878. 30 more years," he said. "I am committed." "You have never been good at avoiding commitment either," she observed. He laughed and she smiled, and the swing moved in the morning air, and the meadowlarks were very insistent about the beauty of the day, and the Kansas sky was exactly the impossible clean blue it had always been, over the land that was theirs. James married in 1907. A capable and warm-natured woman named Dorothea, who had come west from Illinois to teach school, and had been introduced to James at a church social by Clara, who had determined over the course of 6 months that Dorothea was exactly the right match for her brother, and had engineered the introduction with the same efficient precision she brought to her medical practice. James and Dorothea married in June, and moved into the house on Edwin's original property, which had been expanded over the years into something genuinely comfortable. The first grandchild, Edwin James Yates, arrived in May of 1908, and Edwin the grandfather held him in the kitchen of the ranch house with the particular stillness of a man experiencing something he does not have words for, and Lavinia stood beside him and looked at this new face and felt the continuation of things, the deep and abiding continuity of love given and returned across time. "He has James's nose," Edwin said. "He has your hands," Lavinia said, looking at the newborn's large-knuckled and already capable-looking fists. "God help him," Edwin said, looking at his own weather-beaten hands. "They are good hands," Lavinia said. "They have built good things." He looked at her over the baby's head, and she looked at him. And what passed between them in that moment was everything. The flour sack in the October morning and the water rights discussion, and the December snow, and the wedding before the judge and the children born and raised and sent into the world, and the porch swing and 30 years of Sunday mornings, and the fires and the difficulties and the particular daily warmth of being known completely by another person who loves what they know. Yes, he said. They have. Robert left Caldwell Creek in 1909, at 23, to study art in Chicago, which was a fact that nobody in the family was surprised by and that everyone had been quietly preparing for since he was a boy sitting on the porch steps making drawings of horses and asking precise questions about the nature of love for a place. He came back for Christmas and for the summer month and sent home paintings that Lavinia hung on the walls of the ranch house until the hallway was a gallery, and he wrote letters that were long and careful, and very much the letters of a person who is living his right life and knows it. Clara, by 1910, had a practice that was the busiest in the county, and an assistant she had trained from local stock, a young woman of 16 named Anne who had come to her asking how to become a doctor, and who Clara was teaching the way Edwin had taught Caleb Marsh, methodically, and with the patience of someone who recognizes a genuine vocation. The ranch in the 1910s was a different kind of operation from the one it had been in the 1880s. The world had moved on, as it always does, and the cattle industry had moved with it, more mechanized, more connected to the national market by rail and by telephone, which had come to Caldwell Creek in 1902, and which Edwin had viewed with the cautious curiosity of a man encountering something genuinely new. He had come to appreciate it. Lavinia had come to rely on it for ranch business, because being able to speak directly to the buyer in Kansas City was vastly more efficient than letters. James ran the cattle operation now, with Caleb's son helping him, because Caleb had semi-retired and his son Marcus had grown into the work. James was a fine cattleman, better in some ways than Edwin, because he had grown up with the knowledge that Edwin had spent years acquiring, and he had added to it with his own observations and instincts. Edwin, at 66 in 1910, was still physically capable and still rode the ranch most mornings, but he had genuinely ceded the daily management to James, and it sat well with him, the way a thing sits well when you have let it go to the right hands at the right time. In the mornings he read. He had discovered in the quieter years that he was an avid reader, which was something he had not known about himself when he was a young man driving cattle, because there had been neither time nor books. Lavinia brought books on her trips to town and ordered others through the catalog, and they had accumulated a library in the room that had been originally a spare bedroom and was now lined with shelves, proper bookshelves that Edwin had built himself. Lavinia still ran the financial side of the operation, still sat with the accounts and the contracts and the negotiations with the precision that had always been her strength. She was 53 in 1900 and 63 in 1910, and she remained exactly herself, the same sharp-eyed and composed and deeply competent woman she had always been, with the silver now fully through her dark hair, and the lines around her eyes that were evidence of a life lived outdoors, and the particular warmth in her expression, when she looked at her grandchildren that had softened something in her face into something more openly joyful than the younger Lavinia would have allowed. She had 2 grandchildren by 1912, Edwin James and his sister Frances, born in 1910, and she was present for both of them in the way she had not had the luxury of being present for her own children's earliest years, because the ranch had demanded everything then and now demanded less, and she found grandmothering to be a specific and enormous pleasure that she had not anticipated and could not get enough of. Edwin James called her grandma and climbed on her like she was furniture, which she permitted with the fond tolerance of a woman who has nothing left to prove. In the winter of 1913, when the snow came hard to Kansas, and the wind moved across the open range with the old elemental indifference to human comfort that it had always had, Edwin and Lavinia sat by the fireplace in the library, the wide, deep fireplace that Lavinia had told him how to build 35 years ago, and Edwin read and Lavinia wrote letters, one to Robert in Chicago and one to Clara who was at a medical conference in St. Louis. And the fire was warm, And the house was quiet because James and Dorothea were in their own house with their own fire. Edwin looked up from his book and watched Lavinia write, her hand moving across the paper with the same decisive efficiency she brought to everything, and he felt the fullness again, the enormous and simple fullness that had been the defining quality of his life with her. "What?" she said without looking up. She always knew when he was watching her. "Nothing," he said. "I am just looking." She looked up. Her eyes in the firelight were the same sharp, dark eyes they had always been, and she looked at him with the complete knowledge of a woman who has been looking at the same man for 35 years and finding him every time. "Edwin," she said. "Yes, I love you very much." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, without embellishment and without diminishment, just true and plain and complete. "I love you very much." The fire crackled, and the snow moved against the windows, and the library was warm and full of books, and outside in the white winter dark the ranch lay quiet under its covering of snow, waiting for spring the way it always did, patient and enormous in theirs. Clara came home from the conference with a paper she had presented receiving mention in the conference proceedings, which she told them about at Sunday dinner in January with the controlled excitement of someone who has been trained to be composed and has nearly lost the battle. "They are going to publish it," she said, "in the Quarterly Journal." Lavinia looked at her daughter, Dr. Clara Yates, 31 years old and published in a medical journal, and felt a pride so large it was almost painful. "Tell me exactly what the paper said," Lavinia told her, and Clara told her, all of it in detail, and Lavinia listened to every word. And Edwin listened with his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes bright. And James listened with the earnest attention of a man who does not fully understand medicine, but understands that his sister has done something important. And Dorothea held baby Francis and smiled, and Edwin James, 5 years old, fell asleep in his chair halfway through, but that was all right. Robert came home for Christmas of 1913 and brought with him a painting he had made for the house, a large oil painting of the Yates ranch as seen from the rise of the east pasture in the early morning, the buildings and the fences and the horses and the dawn sky over it all in the gold and blue of a Kansas June morning. He hung it above the fireplace in the parlor, and when Edwin saw it he stood in front of it for a long time and said nothing, and Lavinia came and stood beside him and took his hand. "That is us," Edwin said finally. "Yes," Robert said, "it is. It was them, all of them. The land and the light and the life they had built on ground that had once been separate, a widow's ranch and a cowboy's new property, joined into something that was larger than either had been alone, as things tend to be when the joining is made from the right materials." Edwin was 69 in 1913, and strong for 69, the kind of strong that comes from a lifetime of physical work and clean air and a reason to get up in the morning, and Lavinia was 66. And they had the porch swing and the Sunday mornings and the library full of books and the grandchildren and the children who had grown into the people they were always meant to be. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. On the last Sunday of December 1913, with the new year coming in just days, Edwin and Lavinia sat in the parlor with Robert's painting above the fireplace and a new fire burning deep and warm in the grate, and they could hear James and Dorothea's voices in the kitchen and the children somewhere in the house and Clara's footsteps on the porch from her evening walk. Edwin reached over and took Lavinia's hand. He had taken her hand 10,000 times, and it still felt like what it always had, like a homecoming. "Are you happy?" he asked. She turned her head and looked at him. This man who had ridden into Caldwell Creek 35 years ago with trail dust on his coat and taken a flour sack out of her arms, who had said he was not good at avoiding, and had proven it every day since, who had sat in the cold morning on her porch step and asked her to marry him because the thought of her in anyone else's kitchen was intolerable, who had listened to everything she said and built his house in the right place and held his children and made her coffee and called her by her name as if it belonged in his mouth. "I am so happy," she said, and it was the fullest and most honest thing she had ever said, and she had always been honest. He squeezed her hand, and the fire burned warm and steady, and outside the Kansas winter settled over the land that was theirs, the land they had built and worked and loved. And inside the house was full of every good thing a life can hold. And Lavinia Yates looked at her husband and knew, with the same certainty with which she had always known the things that were true, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be and exactly who she was supposed to be with, and that it was going to remain so for all the good years still ahead of them.